Okay, so welcome everyone to our seminar series, Everything is Energy. For those who don't know me, I am Andrea Hurst. I'm a prof of philosophy and I hold the Iscia chair, which is the host of this series. This is an NRF funded chair in humanities at Nelson Mandela University. And I'm very happy this morning to introduce Ragnar van der Merwe as our speaker today. Ragnar's been with us before, speaking about complexity. He's a postdoc at the University of Johannesburg, and his interests are in philosophy of science, what truth means, and pragmatism, complexity. And he wrote a thesis focused on how we can have knowledge in a complex world. A hell of a difficult topic, that. And also, what does this mean for notions like scientific progress and truth? Today he will be offering us, as far as I can understand from your abstract, a critical account of big history. And as far as I can tell, big history interprets what are kind of the supposed individuated objects and processes around us as manifestations of primordial energy, kind of emanating from the Big Bang. So without any further ado, I am very happy to have you here, Ragnar, and I will hand over to you. I'm going to mute myself and disappear.
Okay, thanks very much. Let me get my things set up here. Okay. So the title of my talk, Introducing the Subject into Big History, a Mask of Theory over the Face of Nature. So I'm going to discuss big history briefly, which is a sort of more of a kind of a cosmology than a history, really. I'm then going to discuss a problem with big history, which is, as I said in the abstract, that big history purports to account for the entire cosmic picture, sort of to give a full account of the universe, but it doesn't account for subjectivity, which is something very important to each of us, obviously. I then introduced William Whewell, whose quote is in my title, A Mask of Theory over the Face of Nature. So this is a sort of Kantian view where there's always subjectivity overlaid onto the world during inquiry. I'll then introduce the experienced pragmatists who have a similar view that mind and world merge in experience. So this is not the kind of linguistic-oriented pragmatism that one gets from Richard Rorty, for example. The experienced pragmatists, in Kantian fashion, acknowledge the role of the external world in inquiry. I'll then talk about John Wheeler's participatory universe, so that's sort of a view from physics. And then work in progress is this subjectivism. So if the subject overlays history, is this a kind of idealism or subjectivism? And if not, what kind of way forward might we sketch? So, sorry, let me just move things around here. So big history was developed by Australian historian David Christian and has been funded by Bill Gates. Big history is a so-called meta-view that merges human history, evolutionary biology, cosmology, and other historical sciences into one universal history, a grand narrative of cosmic evolution. Big history, according to Christian, is a modern global origin story that interprets the putatively individuated objects and processes around us as all being manifestations of the primordial energy that emanated from the Big Bang. First to emerge in the universe was the stuff of physics, then chemistry, then microbiology, and so on, all the way to present-day advanced technology and the human mind. Each of these stages is understood as clusters or rucks of dynamical energy. The world ontology is fundamentally energy flowing and evolving through time, obeying the second law of thermodynamics, forming complex phenomena along the way. The universe begins simple but evolves by way of dynamic increasing complexity to manifest all the intricate things we fascinate over in the sciences, including ourselves. Christian suggests that big history can unify splintered scholarly disciplines. It is, he says, an attempt to describe the large patterns that make sense of the details. Big history rediscovers an interest in deep, even law-like patterns of change. So there's this cosmic story from the Big Bang up to the human present, and the unifying motif is energy. Everything is sort of energy. So it's kind of a little bit spiritual in a sense, I guess, although Christian wouldn't go that route, but we often hear this sort of from the spiritual, commentators, that everything is energy and so on. But that's not exactly what he's getting at. So big history tells the story of the universe from start to present. The story is told in 8 stages or thresholds: origins, stars and galaxies, molecules, Earth, life, humans, agriculture, and the modern revolution. So it's quite sort of anthropocentric in that, from a cosmic perspective, Earth, life, humans, agriculture are not particularly important. But he does have reasons for why he introduces the anthropocentrism. I won't go into them here, but they are quite convincing. Big history attempts to shed light on timeless philosophical questions, such as who am I, where did I come from, and where are we going? It does so by understanding human beings as part of a grand cosmic evolutionary process. Big history, says Christian, is, quote, an attempt at what E.O. Wilson has called consilience, a return to the goal of a unified understanding of reality in place of the fragmented visions that dominate modern education and scholarship. Blurring the traditional boundary between the social sciences and the natural sciences, big history tracks universal patterns of cause and change, spanning from the origin of the universe to the present. It seeks to place the human situation within a broader cosmic narrative informed by empirical methods such as radiocarbon dating, genetic analysis, and thermodynamic measurements. However, a tension arises for big history's purely objectivist or descriptive approach. Scientific and historical disciplines have semantic content that must seemingly involve an interpreter, i.e. a subject. I'm taking history to be a kind of science, at least to the degree that it engages with archaeology and paleontology and so on. Big history claims to give an encompassing account of the universe, including humanity, but disregards the subjectivity so central to the human condition. Big history aspires to an overarching explanation of the world, to a unified understanding of reality, yet excludes an account of what arguably matters most to us, i.e. the subject. And the same applies to standard cosmology or history. There isn't this kind of subjectivity. It's always sort of done from a distance, as is typical of the scientific method. We're only told that subjectivity is summoned by or bubbles up from the brain, which isn't particularly helpful. I propose instead that subjectivity permeates the whole of science, including the historical sciences. Science is always practiced by inquirers or subjects who cannot strip those parts of their discipline's factual content that are contributed by the mind from those that are contributed by the world. Moreover, those subjects necessarily express that factual content in terms of narratives or theories that are subject imbued. This notion of subject and world entwined, subject and object or mind and world, has been articulated by philosophers like Kant, William Whewell, and pragmatists, often tacitly influenced by their work. The general idea has also been articulated by physicist John Archibald Wheeler. The view I propose is Kantian in nature. There are both conceptual and empirical components to the world identified in scientific inquiry, including historical inquiry. Both theory and fact, both the a priori and the a posteriori, constitute what things are. In other words, subject and object are entwined in constituting the stuff of science. Inspired by Kant, William Whewell claimed that we can think of sensations as the matter and ideas as the form of our knowledge. So sensations sort of coming from the world and ideas coming from the mind, or the object and the subject. In other words, the world provides the objective empirical content, while we, as inquiring subjective agents, provide the theory that together constitutes scientific knowledge. This is very Kantian, right? So the world gives us something, sort of the noumenal world, and we sort it with our kind of mental projections. This introduces the subject into science and therefore into big history. Like Kant before him, Whewell developed a philosophy of science that aimed for a middle ground between rationalist realism and empiricist anti-realism. There is no clear-cut separation between subject and object, between theory and fact, between mind and world. Scientific inquiry oscillates between passive reflection and tangible participation. Both hypothesis and experiment play an inseparable role in generating scientific knowledge and therefore truths. Every inquiring act knits subject and world together. For Whewell, there's a mask of theory over the whole face of nature. Or as William James put it, the trail of the human serpent is over everything. Whewell had a strong influence on Charles Sanders Peirce, who the experienced pragmatist, who I'll talk about in a moment, see as sort of the founding father of pragmatism, rather than James, or at least the correct version of pragmatism. According to Whewell, we do not perceive solid objects. We only perceive shapes, colors, and shades. The solidity these sense impressions have is a unifying form provided by the subject. In scientific terms, we can think of the co-evolution of subjective theory with the objective output of experiment as constituting the ongoing, albeit fallibilistic, progression of science. Subject and object co-evolve as a function of our best science in action. The same goes for history and therefore big history. Narrative and fact co-evolve in generating historical truths. We cannot separate the narrative subject from the objective facts. The two are intimately entwined in producing truths about the past. We cannot take a detached and objective God's eye view as big history purports to do. We can never step outside of our subjectivity to take a God's eye view. And maybe even God, assuming God has subjectivity, God would also have the same problem. There can be no observer or inquirer in the sense that we understand these terms that does not itself introduce subjectivity into its investigations into the nature of the world or the nature of history. So for experienced pragmatists like Cheryl Misak and Stephen Levine, the mind does not represent, mirror, or copy reality, but neither is reality simply a product of language games. Instead, like Kant, we impose human categories on worldly experiences. And like Whewell, subject and object merge in experience. So there's the subject and the object that come together and they sort of entwine in experience. So the experience is this key kind of mediator between what the mind gives and what the world gives. According to Misak, we cannot pry apart our interpretation from what is interpreted. We are interpretive engines, she says, coordinating and merging theory with data in generating knowledge and truth. So as I mentioned, this is not the linguistic or subjectivist pragmatism that Rorty's influence has many associate pragmatism with the Rortyian version of pragmatism, where we are sort of bound within language or bound within mental constructs. The experienced pragmatists insist on this worldly component that plays a role. It's not simply a matter of construction or conceptual generation. Okay, so on to John Wheeler. John Wheeler says, we are participators in bringing into being not only the near and here, but the far away and long ago. We are in this sense participators in bringing about something of the universe in the distant past. So this is Wheeler's famous little sketch of, I think he drew it himself, of sort of the origin of the universe and then the universe looking back on itself. So when the cosmologist inquires into the origin of the universe, it's kind of like the Ouroboros, like the universe looking back on itself. I'm not quite sure about this, if it's a bit crude, but it kind of gives an idea of what at least Wheeler had in mind. And then Alexei Nestoruk says humanity is co-present in all points of what it observes in the universe or imagines, while physically being restricted to an insignificant part of it. So we kind of paste ourselves onto everything that we study, including the entire cosmos in a sense. This is quite radical. I'm not quite sure if I want to go as far as Wheeler and Nestoruk go, but that's kind of the idea. For Wheeler, reality, i.e. the totality of the world, is constituted through the interaction of an inarticulate out there with human inquirers who create and the network of questions and answers directed to and received from this reality. So they do acknowledge a reality out there. Wheeler kind of flip-flops between what seems like a kind of idealism, as in the universe creates itself, or we create the universe, which is a bit sort of Deepak Chopra-ish. But at other times he acknowledges the role of the world out there in this process, which I think is essential. We don't want to go full-blown idealism, or at least I don't. Wheeler's appeal is similar to a phenomenological assertion that without taking into account the generating power of human subjectivity, the efficacy of the sciences, either human or natural, remains obscured. For Wheeler and Nestoruk, the notion of physical reality, nature, or the universe only makes sense in the context of humanity, that is, in terms of observer or subject-driven inquiry. The world is not a clock-like machine that has been pre-constructed, then discovered by human observers. Instead, it is a self-synthesized system coming into existence through the co-constitution of mind and matter. Wheeler maintains that there is no way out of the cycle. There is no foundation of the cycle outside itself. We can say that the world receives its explanation from within itself. For Wheeler, observers are necessary to bring the universe into being. Okay, now that's a bit too radical for me, although I don't want, the universe is already there, it just only takes on a sort of an ontological or a scientific character once observers are there. But as I said, Wheeler sort of flip-flops between what seems like quite a radical idealist or spiritualist view to the more Kantian view that I have in mind. The idea is that something that is initially undifferentiated and non-articulated becomes something sensible and intelligent. So that I agree with. Something initially undifferentiated, non-articulated, the noumenal realm, becomes something sensible and intelligent once we paste our concepts and our sort of mental constructs onto it. Now, this is a diagram from Nestoruk's paper. According to Nestoruk, these diagrams or models can only exist within, quote, the presence of intelligence which creates the diagram. The physical genesis depicted requires a reflecting consciousness which has propensities which do not simply follow from the chain of physical causations. What is missing is the presence of the subject for whom this diagram makes sense. So here's different diagrams. There's the Ouroboros idea. Here's a kind of hierarchy of looks like according to size from atoms all the way up to galaxies. And here's John Wheeler's participatory universe idea. The details aren't too important, but here we have observers kind of through physics generating meaning that cycles back to them. But Nestoruk's point is that even if you include observers in your diagram, that's not good enough to say that you've accounted for subjectivity, because the creator of the diagram and anyone who observes the diagram brings their own subjectivity to this situation. It's a kind of a infinite regress of subjective observers. So even a diagram that purports, like the one that we looked at earlier, like this one, that purports to show the universe, in fact requires observers who make sense, who design and make sense of the diagram. Even the Big Bang, says Nestoruk, appears to be a mental construct. It purports to describe the origin of the universe, but it does so through reference to here and now. This is because its theory is constructed upon observations made here and now. The question of the physical existence of the Big Bang must be placed in the context of how it is constituted and articulated by human observers here and now. It cannot be any other way, right? That's inescapable. So here is that diagram. Here we have Alan Guth, who formulated the idea of inflation, the idea that there's this period of rapid inflation at the Big Bang. It's still controversial. He hasn't won the Nobel Prize for it because it hasn't been empirically confirmed. But you will see most diagrams of cosmic evolution include this inflationary period, but it hasn't actually become a scientific fact as such. Here's Kip Thorne, who won the Nobel Prize in 2017 for the discovery of gravitational waves. But the point is that when they develop their theories of cosmic evolution or origins of the universe, they look back from the present. And so they imbue their theories and their models with the kind of subjectivity. And we, in turn, when we understand or try to understand their theories, we bring our own subjectivity to that inquiry. Wheeler states that, quote, "The past is theory. The past has no existence except as it is recorded in the present. For Wheeler and Nesteruk, the history of the universe is constructed by us. The universe's past is seen from our perspective in the present." Okay, so work in progress. Is this subjectivism? No. Okay, nor is it relativism, idealism, full-blown constructivism, post-structuralism, panpsychism, solipsism, or phenomenology. There is a mind-independent world out there that influences our experiments and constrains our subjective theories. Our ability to make accurate predictions and coordinated technological manipulations of the world confirms the existence of a recalcitrant and constraining world that has some nature independent of us. So we have to admit that there is a noumenal world that exists prior to inquiry, even if we cannot decide any properties. Once we do so, we taint it with subjectivity. But I think that we have to be able to say that something exists outside of our theoretical constructs. Otherwise, we face all the well-known problems with idealism. But once you begin to theorize about this noumenal world out there, once you begin to assign properties to it, we indubitably introduce subjectivity. The world, past and present, is imbued with the human stain. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ragnar. Sure. There's a lot of density in that. So while people are thinking about what points of discussion to raise, would you mind turning your PowerPoint or taking it off so that we can, so we can see your face in the so-called reel. Okay, so we've got quite a bit of time for discussion and questions. So you can raise your hand as Chris has, or ask me in the chat. But yeah, so find some way of alerting me to the fact. So yeah, let's ask Chris to come on board and yeah, Chris, ask your question.
Hello. Hi there.
Chris.
Hi.
Thanks
Yes.
for the talk, Ragnar. Andrea for hosting that. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, yes, we can.
Hi, sorry, I'm at a political science conference, so I'm sitting in a kitchen at the moment almost. But anyway, I caught most of that. I just came in slightly late. I wanted to ask, there were quite a few philosophical approaches that were ruled out at the end. And I wasn't quite sure why. For instance, there was much of the description seemed to align quite well with a phenomenology as influenced by the Kantian tradition. And so, as far as I am aware, phenomenology does not rule out a mind-independent world. It's just an assertion that what we know of the world is known by human subjects with their viewpoint, so that we bring our viewpoint with us to our knowledge of the world. And so that seemed very much, Ragnar, what you were describing. And I was wondering why you were ruling out phenomenology. But what I'm quite interested in from Husserl, from early Husserl, is that Husserl thinks that we can effectively bracket out our subjectivity in our understanding of the world. And we do that by identifying what the subject is and what it contributes to its perspective. And so if you can identify exactly what we're bringing to the picture, and then you take all those factors and you delete them, what you'll have left is the mind independent world with the subject bracketed out. And I've always been very suspicious of that. And I was wondering if you think we can do that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. So I'm glad to hear that phenomenologists recognize, or at least some phenomenologists recognize the mind-dependent external world. I'm not an expert on phenomenology. I did read a book, and it was very confusing. And like you, I'm suspicious of the idea of firstly identifying what subjectivity contributes, because we can't be sure. Studies in cognitive science and so on are ongoing. Color seems to be something that we contribute, but even that is debated. But there's many things. It's not at all clear what exactly the mind. We would need that third man view in order to really be able to distinguish what the mind contributes. I think we can have some good ideas, but I think it's still pretty vague. And even if we could identify those things and then sort them apart, bracket them, it would be a subject doing that. So there would still be this subjectivity sort of involved in the process of bracketing. So I don't think that, because once you've bracketed what's subjective, a subject continues to inquire into what is left. So I assume your smile means you agree, or you've heard this before. But I'm not a phenomenologist, so that's just my.
Regress.
Yes. Yeah, it seems inescapable.
Okay, we seem to have lost Chris. All right, well, if Chris comes back, we'll continue the conversation. In the meantime, Gary has something to say. His hand is raised. So, Gary?
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. And thanks, Ragnar. I'm interested from your viewpoint that you are suggesting here, in terms of the matter that exists outside of the human view. Is it unitary? I don't know if that's the right term, but is it, science was always, in terms of objectivity, trying to remove the subject so it could get to this one truth type thing. Is there one way of seeing that matter, or for us as humans, is it individual? Everyone has a different view of the same thing. I don't know if that makes sense.
So I don't. So the noumenal realm, which is sort of what you're referring to, that thing or that stuff or whatever it is, Kant refers to it as a something equals X. So sort of trying not to label it, because once you label it, you then bring these subjective elements in. So there's this sort of, it's a problem with Kantianism that as soon as you talk about this noumenal realm, you are, so we call it noumenal, now we're assigning a property to it, or calling it is sort of the same problem. So that's the main challenge with this type of Kantian view. And that's what postmodernists sort of bite the bullet here. Or post-structuralists would say, yeah, but that's a cheat. You can't now sort of say this is one thing which has a special status that doesn't have a subject imbued over it. And they bite the bullet and then go sort of full-blown constructionist. But I think there has to be, I mean, to say that history didn't exist, or there was no stuff in the universe before human inquirers came along. That's just bizarre. Like, it can't be right. Okay, I mean, there were something like galaxies and stars and things before human beings evolved. And again, some postmodernists bite the bullet. I can't remember his name now, but there was a philosopher, postmodern philosopher of science, who said, well, you know, certain diseases didn't exist before we came along and labeled them. You know, so like certain viruses, they actually did not exist before they were epidemiologists gave them a tag. Then they exist once they are assigned a human concept. And that can't be right. That's just too bizarre. I mean, in philosophy, I think you're always kind of choosing the least worst theory, you know. So Kantianism has its problems, but the alternative, which is this full-blown constructionism, has well-known problems. One of them is what your sort of question related to, which is, how do we coordinate our efforts around in the world? So how can a team of technologists come together to manufacture things like smartphones or whatever, or how can physicists coordinate their efforts if each one is constructing their own reality? So there has to be some underlying stuff, something equals X, that we can coordinate around. We don't create the sun. Derrida said, we create the sun. The sun it only exists when you look at it, kind of thing. That's just too out there. But saying that it's a singular thing or that it's many things, I suppose as observers kind of pushed against this thing, they will bring different conceptual apparatus to it. But talking about its own properties, as in whether it's a singular thing or it's many little things, is it a blob or is it many little particulates? That, I think, is going too far. I think it always remains mysterious, because as soon as we try and sort of grab at it, we inevitably bring our subjectivity that interferes. But it's there. So I think we can assign it one characteristic, which is the or property, if you like, although I don't think existence is a property. So this is sort of a long debate. Is existence a property of something? So I want to try and, my way forward, I think, is to say that existence is a sort of a unique or special concept, different to others. To say that something exists is not to assign it a property. So I can say, hopefully, that the noumena exists, but nothing, we can never say anything else about it. We can't say that it has any other properties. And so that's a tentative way I'd like to try and get out of this.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ragnar. There are a couple of, I'm just going to, jump in here, take advantage of my position as, I think one of the things, though, is that you're thinking about these kinds of problematics would have to be a whole lot more complex. I think what you're doing, as far as I know you named Derrida, which is and mentioned that Derrida says, well, the sun doesn't exist until we look at it. This is absolute nonsense. So you need to be a bit more complex, I think, in your understanding of the theorists that you are challenging, perhaps, like phenomenology, those kinds of things. You actually need to know about them before you can write them off. And I think that you're absolutely right, though, that whatever you want to call it, our understanding of the world that we're in is a combination between some kind of subject input that is processing some kind of real out there input to it. So it's a combination of them both. I think that Kantian position is absolutely right. There is, as you say, absolutely no point in trying to understand what the noumenal realm is like. We have a better capacity to try to understand subjectivity and what we contribute, just because we have some, but again, we'll never know completely what it is like, but we have some sense of what it is like. And with Kant, the subjective contribution is a whole formal structure of categories and ideas, rational kind of structure. And that's why we can have knowledge, according to him, because we have knowledge of that structure. That is questionable. That is what phenomenologists begin to question, that clear knowledge of the structure that we bring to the constitution of the world, if you want to put it that way. So our structure is, so the structure of subjectivity, I think, is that it is not, well, it's not structured, it's plastic, and there are different complex elements of subjectivity that you'd need to take into account. So when you say bring the subject in, you'd have to figure out, well, what aspect of the subject are you actually talking about? Is it the formal structure, the categories of the understanding, that kind of thing? Is it the what Kant called the empirical subject, your emotions, your feelings, your basic attitudes to different things in the world? Sorry, I'm rattling on a bit, but like Gary would say that science is trying to exclude the subject. Well, it is trying to exclude the empirical subject, but it cannot possibly, as you say, include the formal subject. Is it that capacity to categorize? What is that actual subjective contribution? That would be something that I think would need thinking about in a much, much more complex way than you have so far. I think that would help you maybe not make sweeping statements about some of the philosophies that have looked at this very, very carefully. Okay, apologies. I mean, I'm really rattling on here, but this is something that I think is quite important. What I would like you to do, this is the real question, actually, is bring it perhaps back to energy. So you're talking about the energy theory, the theory that everything is energy. So how does your way of thinking, which I largely agree with, I must say, but how does your way of thinking give us something else with which to understand our kind of being in the world?
Okay, there were sort of three issues there. First one being my nonsense understanding of Derrida. Although I haven't read a lot about phenomenology, I have read a lot about Derrida, and the way I'm interpreting him is not ridiculous. It's many scholars have interpreted him that way. As far as I understand it, the phrase there's nothing outside the text means there's nothing outside of our constructions. There's nothing outside of what we create. And I don't want to get into a sort of a contest about who's read more Derrida books or who's, been studying Derrida for longer, but my eyes stick by my understanding of at least Derridean post-structuralism, that it is a full-blown constructionist view. He repeatedly says that we cannot talk about something outside of our constructs. So you've really got to sort of twist and turn and interpret him a certain way to get Kant out of Derrida. Speaking about Kant, the second issue, I'm very suspicious of Kant's very complex epistemology with the sort of different types of subjects, and this it's obviously, as you say, that's something I'll need to work on. What elements of subjectivity? How does this a more full-blown epistemology? This is my talk here was really just to make a point about science and history, but I don't want to go full-blown Kantian on the epistemology. I think I'm much more likely to turn to cognitive science. But for now, the point is just to get that sort of idea out there, which might seem obvious to us, which is good, to the participants here, but will be quite interesting or surprising to, I think, many, especially those working in cosmology or history rather than non-analytic philosophy. Even analytic philosophers will be quite surprised at what I'm saying, because the sort of the great flaw with analytic philosophy is that it assumes that God's eye view that I've criticized, that we can stand apart from language and world and give a kind of a detached model of the relationship, or the mind is between mind and world. Mind is here and it relates through a reference relationship. So for pragmatists, postmodernists, etc., this will all seem quite obvious, although there is this issue of that something out there, which I think you get from Kant and experienced pragmatism, but not from Rorty and Derrida. Then your third point was to do with what it has to say about our place in the world. I'm not really sure. I think it's just interesting to think about subjectivity, kind of the Big Bang being imbued with subjectivity. That just seems sort of so strange, but somehow inescapable. As soon as we talk about it or study it, the origin of the universe, it all sounds very sort of spiritual almost. Subjectivity was present at the origin of the universe. But I don't have any kind of existential lesson here, or there's no ethic to it. It's just an interesting thought that I'm exploring and that I think is under-recognized.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So it's a pity there's no existential lesson that would be would make philosophy at least useful. But yeah, apologies for taking so much time. But we still have a fair amount of time for discussion. So anyone else? Can I hear other voices? So, okay, one of the things, I'm going to jump in again while everyone's thinking, but what I found really interesting is this kind of cosmic narrative that talks about the Big Bang in terms of the origins and the stars and the molecules and all of that. You said it was that the arguments for the anthropocentrism were fairly kind of convincing, that I find fascinating, because it's really, I mean, you get this sense of an incredibly subjective way of modeling the world, if you're talking about origin, stars, molecules, and then suddenly Earth and humans and life and agriculture and all of that. So how does the or what can you tell us more about that anthropocentrism?
I remember the arguments being convincing, and I can't quite remember actually what they were. I think, if I remember correctly, the gist is that because I think he's got 2 points. I think the one is that as far as we know, complexity is at its highest here in the Anthropocene, in the Anthropocene. So there's sort of the human brain and the internet or whatever are the most complex things we know of. So there's a sort of, there may be others, but as yet there's no evidence for this. And so therefore the humans do have a sort of a special status in the cosmos due to this complex, having the most complexity attached to us. And I think the other point is that he makes is that because we are doing big history, or because we're doing science or history, an anthropocentric viewpoint is justified, since it's kind of, we care about our place in the cosmos. And so since it's a story written for humans, we are sort of justified in putting ourselves at the center, which I think is fair enough. You know, we do care about our situation, obviously, here on Earth. And so a history that has the Earth and humans as its kind of fulcrum seems warranted, given the target audience, or given, you know, that historical and scientific inquiry is practiced by human beings on planet Earth.
So in a way, they're confirming your position that you can't eradicate the subject.
I guess so, yeah, without explicitly stating as much. Yeah.
Okay, Gary put something on chat. Gary, do you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, I was just interested whether it was the distinction between I can never say it, Anthropocene or anthropomorphism, as in the human influence of the view of how things are, that we always see the human within everything, or this era is the human era. I don't know if that makes it clearer. I was just interested which point you were making. Yeah. Is it?
Yeah, I think they give an emphasis to both. So I would say probably both, because the most recent stage in big history is the I don't know if they call it the Anthropocene, or if he calls it the technical. What was the last one? Let me just check my slides here. The modern revolution is what he calls the most recent stage. So the modern revolution would, I guess, include the Anthropocene, as I understand. But the anthropocentrism is to do with justifying why the modern revolution is considered to be the most recent stage in cosmic evolution, rather than a bigger picture where the Earth is just irrelevant, as cosmologists like to say. You know, the Earth is just a speck in one galaxy and so on. But big history focuses in on this one planet, and the justification for that is, or the justification for including the Anthropocene, is anthropocentrism, if that makes sense.
The reason I raise it is that there's quite a debate within the environmental sector, and as to whether that you can label this most recent period the Anthropocene. You know, and so it's generally a geological or archaeological term, and there's quite a bit of debate within natural sciences versus social sciences, human sciences, as to whether you can now describe it as humans impacting the Earth in such a way that it, you know, yeah. So no, I was just interested how you got there. So that, in that sense, yeah.
Yeah, I've never quite made sense of the term Anthropocene. I can understand anthropomorphism, but the Anthropocene, I've never quite figured out what it means. But it's not really something big history is too concerned with, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I mean, just to explain, the Anthropocene generally is based on the assumption that humans now influence the planet in a way that is now recorded on in the planet's geology, and well, in terms of the, you know, so the example most often used is the radioactive material which is created by humans, in terms of the atomic bombs, and that is now covers the entire Earth. So there isn't a place on the planet that isn't. And the more recent one is that microplastics now also cover the entire Earth, and that's archaeologists in 1,000 years will come back and that will be the marker for them, is this layer of plastic and radioactive material across the earth. So that's the argument for the Anthropocene. But others are saying it's an abuse of sort of geological terms. So there's always this kind of natural science need to remove the human to kind of get to this kernel of what, that you have an undisputable truth to the object that you're looking at, is my read of it, and that, it's just it plays out in a whole bunch of other realms as a consequence.
Okay, thanks, Gary. Helen has raised her hand. Could we kind of bring her voice in, and then Chris again, and then we'll continue this conversation. So Helen?
Unmuting. Okay.
Hi, Helen.
Thank you. I've got this thing in my head, and I'm going to try and put it into words. I'm thinking about something Neil Turok, a physicist, once said, that as far as the universe goes, the very, very large, we know what's going on. The very, very small, we humans know what's going on. I don't know, but it's pretty much laid down in the context of empirical science, that they've had their theories, they've tested them, they found evidence, gravitation waves, all of that business. But the middle, between the very big and the very small, is messy, in his words. So that means basically where life comes in. So all of your biological sciences or medicine or botany or the environmental concerns, whatever. So I don't quite know what I'm asking, but it seems like on the very extremes, subjectivity doesn't so much matter, other than we say this is human science making human sense of the universe, but it's pretty much confirmed within the frame of our science. And in the middle, it's a lot more confused. So what does big history have to say? Like, how would, like, of course, subjectivity is all over. Sorry, I don't know what I'm asking, but if you've got something interesting in response to that, I'd like to hear it.
No, I've got this idea that the degree of subjectivity, or that is contributed compared to the degree of objectivity that is contributed by the world. So that so we're agreeing that the mind and the world co-constitute things, but the degree to which they do so varies according to the domain of inquiry. So in physics, there would be very little subjective interference. There is some, because physicists still they still assign properties to their subject matter. There's still a degree of interpretation, but it's fairly fixed. And then as one goes up the sort of standard hierarchy of domains of inquiry, so you've got, let's say, physics, chemistry, microbiology, biology, sociology, geology, archaeology, psychology. And then once you get up to the sort of tricky, messy areas that you're talking about, even ethics or mathematics, then there's very little of the world playing a role and much more of the mind contributing. But there's always both, but it comes in degrees. So that's a sort of a very bold, it'll probably never get published, but that's my kind of meta. I have got a paper currently under peer review that goes in this direction with regards to truth. So the truth of things, so let's say scientific truths are made true by a co-contribution of the mind and the world, but to different degrees. So that approximates to this kind of hierarchy of disciplines that we've all seen it somewhere, sort of the physics, chemistry, all the way up to sociology, psychology, ethics, mathematics. But a claim like the world plays some role in mathematics is controversial. It's generally considered to be a fully anti-realist type truth. It's fully mathematical truths are true entirely through something like coherence rather than corresponding to the world. But I do have an argument for why there's a bit of the world playing a role, even in mathematical statements. Hilary Putnam argued along these lines. And even in ethics, ethical truths are normally considered to be entirely anti-realist true. Yeah, they don't correspond to the world because then you're crossing the is-ought gap. But I think that even ethical truths have to some degree, some small degree, have to be about the world. They're not entirely detached. And then there's fictional truths or fictional reality. What does that have to do with the world? Or is it entirely constructed by minds? And again, I think the world must play a small role. So Harry Potter, for example, exists, but partly through all the physical instantiations of Harry Potter, all the depictions of him, all the instances of him in writing, and all the people cosplaying Harry Potter partly make up the reality of the entity Harry Potter. But it's also a fictional construction. So again, even in fictional or mathematical discourse, arguably, I believe, I'm getting, very sort of bold here. So Andrea's about to say something about my bold meta claims. But yeah, I think all discourse or all realities, all truths about those realities are co-constituted, but to different degrees. So that messy area you're talking about will perhaps have a lot of construction involved. And that's what makes it messy. There's a lot of mind, a lot of opinions, a lot of subjects involved in constructing that reality. And that makes it messy, political reality, etc. It's not as fixed as physical reality, where there's not so much room for debate.
Okay, thanks, Ragnar. No, I'm not going to jump in. I think that's a good, bold claim. But what I want to do is actually give Chris's question that'll be our last one for, and I think it's an appropriate final question for our seminar. So Chris, go ahead.
Hi there. Sorry for the background here. I just had a very simple question, which was what you're up against. So you've given us quite a plausible critique of the shortcomings of big history, but I was wondering if big history can be improved. What changes? What changes if they accept your critique? Is it still useful? How can it still be useful?
Yeah, so that would relate to what Andrea was saying about developing a more thorough epistemology, perhaps. Sort of, what is the way forward given this? I think for now, my point is just that this be acknowledged. So let's say big history could be improved. The first initial step to improvement would be just simply acknowledging the problem and the fact that subjectivity does imbue historical and scientific inquiry. How that all works, or how you then flesh that out into a full-blown kind of account, it might be impossible, because you'd be facing the problems we spoke about just now, that phenomenology approach faces, and the infinite regress problem. It's probably every philosopher's dream to develop the kind of meta theory that would incorporate mind and world, but it's probably can't be done because of the very problems we've been discussing. You'd need that God's eye view in order to actually give the complete account of the universe, including the subject. I don't think it can be done, but at least it should be recognized, I guess, is the modest claim.
That kind of the point of pragmatism, that they just acknowledge that and then carry on with it. So that you work with what you got.
Yeah. I like pragmatism. Yeah.
Okay, we have actually run out of time. So thank you. I think our message there at least will be to be highly suspicious of any theory or claim that says everything is energy. We maybe. So it's an interesting way of thinking about things. And thank you very much, Ragnar. You've brought up a whole lot of questions and issues. I hope our discussion has been useful in some way to you too. And yeah, I think it's sort of time to say goodbye. I know we all have to run off somewhere, and we will see you again hopefully next week. But in the meantime, have a great weekend, everybody, and thank you very much for a stimulating discussion. Okay. Cheers.